Hello and welcome to the programme. A plea from me, David Foster, to not adjust your sets, even though we are going a little bit green on this round table, because while the world may be infected, it is cleaner. And you might think that the drop in pollution levels and our changes in lifestyle would inevitably be a signpost to a better, greener world. So what are activists so worried about? Well, the feeling is that with attention focused elsewhere, zero emissions targets will be ignored, and with less money to go around, other issues will take priority.
With so many people in lockdown because of coronavirus, there has been a visible impact on our environment. Air pollution has dropped by unprecedented levels, and forecasters expect emissions to fall by more than 5% in 2020, which would be the greatest annual reduction on record. But all these changes are temporary and won't solve the climate crisis, according to the World Meteorological Organization.
This is most likely going to be a short-term improvement, and if we go back to normal, then this drop in emissions won't have a long-lasting impact. COVID is a serious problem, health problem today, and it's also a serious economic problem for the coming couple of years for sure.
With predictions of a major recession because of the virus, campaigners are worried that the global push towards net zero emissions could be hit. Reaching net zero was already set to cost trillions of dollars, and coronavirus is costing the global economy untold billions so far. Governments are offering huge stimulus packages to fight the downturn, but environmental experts say emissions targets shouldn't be forgotten. EU leaders agreed last month that the bloc's coronavirus recovery plan should be consistent with transition to a greener economy, but didn't pledge specific measures. So is COVID-19 a setback in the climate crisis, or an opportunity to shape a greener global economy?
Okay, time to kick these ideas around. Later on, we'll be hearing from the environmental journalist Michael Holder and from the economist Vicky Pryce. But first, joining us on Roundtable from Berlin, we have Richard Black, who's the director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. And in London, we can say hello to Dr. Ralf Martin from Imperial College and London School of Economics. Great to have you both with us. Richard, let me come to you first of all. This is a balancing act. It's about money, but it's also about opportunities.
Yes, it is. And we're seeing quite a spectacular opportunity before us now with what's happening with the oil price and the oil industry, where a number of companies, I think, are looking at an existential crisis, and they're thinking like they've never thought before about what does their business model look like in the years to come. Is it more of the same, or is it a swifter transition to clean energy that already a lot of them are actually looking at? And for governments, of course, the same question. Do they carry on putting money into supporting an industry that has a finite lifetime, or do they actually pull out and encourage those companies to make a transition? And similar things in the airline industry. And we are seeing signals from some governments, Ursula von der Leyen, for example, for the European Commission, some signals from France, for example, just in the last couple of days calling for adequate pricing in carbon during this era of low oil prices, from Austria saying they won't bail out airlines unless those airlines make moves towards lower carbon. And we're seeing some business activity as well. But it's a very mixed picture. And of course, we're at a very early stage in this crisis.
€1 trillion it's going to cost to go totally green. And people are going to say, actually, we need to put that money into health services. We need to put that money into supporting industry, to farmers, et cetera, et cetera. The last thing we're going to think about is whether you drive an electric car.
And of course, a lot of that money does have to go in supporting national health services and so on and so forth. But a huge amount of money is going to go into supporting businesses and helping them get back on their feet, because not all of them will be able to just pick up where they left off. So then the question is, how do you spend that money? Do you actually spend that money on supporting businesses and a business model that has a finite lifetime and is on its way out? Or do you support something that is going to basically grow and become more of an industry of the future? And we can think here, for example, about electric cars, but there are many others. Above all, I think it's going to be about jobs. And there are areas that are neglected across Europe that actually produce an awful lot of jobs for their money and a big payback on investment. One of those that would be very appropriate in many Eastern European countries, as well as countries like the UK, for example, is energy efficiency. Simply putting in insulation and things like this, massive job creator.
I'm going to quote something from Fatih Birol, who's executive director of the International Energy Agency, who had this to say: "We may well see CO2 emissions fall this year as a result of the impact of coronavirus on economic activity, particularly transport. It would most likely be a short-term blip that could well be followed by a rebound in emissions growth as economic activity ramps back up." He's saying this ain't going to last long, isn't he?
No, I agree with that. I mean, while there are some positive developments when it comes to the clean agenda, such as the reduction now, but also, maybe people will travel less as a consequence for that, even when the lockdown is sort of lifted. I think the big worry is that because governments are under strain, and companies are under strain, they will invest less in the transition to clean. So we need to have a strong framework and a strong approach to avoid that this is going to happen. And part of what the EU is saying and all these investment programs various governments have been announcing, that is clearly helpful. But there is the worry that overall, the green transition will slow down. And there's also evidence that this always happens in recession. There's evidence that the last recession led to a slowdown in the transition to the clean agenda, simply because governments had problems with financing and companies had problems with financing.
The problem is, I'll take the Czech Republic as an example here. They are already saying, hang on, we've got better things to do with our money than to go green. And populist leaders may well use this as an excuse to ramp up the rhetoric, to say, look, we're going to help the people, we're going to help the people, we're going to get them jobs, etc., etc. How do you counter that?
I think there are a number of ways in which it can be countered, and you're absolutely right. We are hearing this from the Czech Republic, we've heard it from Poland, and we've also heard it from car makers, for example, in Germany as well, who are saying, this is not the right time to, for example, tax pollution. So that phrase, people's priorities, what do the people want? This is a very interesting question. And I think there are three key actors here, as always, actually. There's the public, there's businesses and investors, and there's government. So one key question is, we saw concern about climate change and appetite for the green transition ramping up in opinion polls over the last few years. So where does that stand now? And where will it stand in a few months? Will the public still be as concerned? We haven't seen a massive amount of polling evidence on that. But what we have seen in the UK, for example, suggests that people are still keen. They do see climate change as serious as coronavirus, and they want it tackled with the same urgency. We need to have that sort of polling done across Europe. Businesses, Ralf is absolutely right that some will be just calling for a return to business as usual. But again, there are inevitably going to be millions of people out of work across Europe as a result of this. So what is the best way to help them to rebuild their businesses? What is the best use of public money? Public money is also going to be scarce. So another question here is, where do private investors want to put their money? And no one's really looked at this yet. It's too early. But we have seen in past years, for example, wind and solar power have been a very attractive place for investors to put their money.
And indeed, the cost of clean energy is actually going down as well. So it's more affordable, isn't it?
That's right. In some sectors, such as electricity and increasingly in electric motoring, it's actually cheaper now to do the new thing. Not the case in all sectors. Still needs to be a big conversation, for example, about heavy industry transformation. But certainly electricity, you can see that this is a big difference from what Ralf was talking about earlier. The last time we had one of these crises in 2008-9, there are all kinds of differences. But one of the biggest is now actually clean is cheaper than dirtier in some very important sectors.
Okay, let's throw this one to Ralf as well. Do you think people have got the message, the public as well as perhaps government and investors, that clean air technology can be innovative and lead to growth?
Well, it's certainly innovative and definitely can lead to growth. And we only will know, a while down the line whether it really has changed attitudes. But there is hope it might have changed attitudes towards expert advice and preparing for the next crisis. I mean, essentially, that is sort of another angle that we have seen now. What happens if we prepare badly for a crisis scientists warn us about? And hopefully, some people will understand that climate change is a similar crisis we have to prepare for. But still, I think there is another channel here, and governments will need revenue, and I think quite apart from lowering carbon taxes and the like, I think it's actually an opportunity to increase carbon taxes, because governments will see that this is an opportunity to close some of the deficits they're accumulating at the moment. And I think that will be potentially a useful channel as well that governments shouldn't neglect.
So not only should they do it from an environmental point of view, but it might be from a self-interest point of view. You could get extra revenue there, perhaps to divert it to those causes that people are clamoring for, as opposed to another wind farm at the end of your road. Could it perhaps, and Richard, let me come to you first on this one, and then you, Ralf. Could it accelerate growth? Could it suddenly become the New Deal?
It could. I think that the supply of public money to stimulate that is going to be short in many countries. So it's partly going to be a question of leveraging private investment, basically finding ways because there will be a pent-up supply of investment money that doesn't get spent this year. So how to get that flowing into green rather than into dirty. There's another part of, you mentioned clean air there, David. There's another part of this story which is yet to play out. There's a quite an active field of scientific research looking at whether air pollution has actually contributed to the incidence and severity of coronavirus. And there are at least 3 papers out there suggesting that it has. Now, if it becomes proven that actually we've had it worse with coronavirus in areas where air pollution has been high, that I think is going to revolutionize the conversation on both heavy industry and transportation.
It's a win-win in a sense, Ralf, but you've got to get that argument across.
Yes, absolutely. And you have to do carbon tax in a clever way, for instance. I mean, you have to be mindful of poorer people who might lose out, and you have to give them some extra transfer, some of the revenue of the carbon tax. And you have to, advertise that so that there is the support and people don't feel that it's unfair and feel shortchanged.
So green is not going dark, in your opinion, Ralf? And then last word from you, Richard, on the same thing. Not going dark?
I've certainly seen no evidence that it would be. Of course, we are at an early stage in this and no one can really tell how it will play out. But I think those key factors, where is business going anyway, where are markets going anyway, where are prices going anyway, that is increasingly towards green. Whereas public opinion, if it picks up, if it shows the same levels of concern about climate change as we've had, and thirdly, from governments, we're seeing mixed signals, but we are seeing important signs from a number of governments that they do want to make their recoveries from this consistent with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. So all to play for, but some encouraging signals, I would say.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. Same to you, Ralf. And I used to hate it when, as a young reporter, I was obliged, apparently, sometimes to say only one thing is certain: nothing will ever be the same again. But these are extraordinary times, and I think that holds true in this case. We will just have to wait and see, because nothing will ever be the same again. Ralf, Richard, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us on Roundtable.
Thank you.
Let us now say hello to Vicky Pryce, Chief Economic Advisor to the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and the environmental journalist Michael Holder from the online news site Business Green. Very good to have both of you here. At any time when you want to say something, do feel free, but I'll throw this one first at Richard. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, described the European Green Deal as Europe's man on the moon moment. Now that we've got to this point, are we looking at an Apollo 13, which was a gallant attempt but didn't quite make it?
Yeah, I think man on the moon is one way of looking at it, but I think it's also a direct necessity, really. I mean, we have to decarbonize our societies or we run into catastrophe. So, yes, it's a man on the moon moment, but it doesn't change the challenge. The challenge and the target for net zero by 2050 is still very much the same. So a lot of work has to be done, and that work hasn't changed. We know what we need to do to decarbonize our society. We need to invest in renewables. We need to change our governance structures. We need to unlock private investment to make that green business happen. That hasn't changed because of this coronavirus crisis. And in some ways, there's a greater opportunity to make that happen. There's a lot of support for not building back the economy as it was before, both among businesses and among citizens of the continent. So really, there's an opportunity to really find a way out of this crisis, which will build back better, I suppose. That's the phrase that's being used a lot at the moment.
Yeah, you see build back better. I get it, but that might require, Vicky, quite a lot of cogitating, quite a lot of contemplation, quite a lot of thinking in the long term. But what's needed to save the European Green Deal, and I suppose the American one too, is action now. Do you see any evidence that might happen?
What has happened in the short term, unfortunately, is the opposite. It's well known that even were to meet any of the targets that have been set, one needs to start doing something now. And what we know is that various countries have said they can't actually afford to do the things they were supposed to do in 2020, given the coronavirus crisis. And we've already seen that the Commission itself has actually said that maybe some of the expectations for this year could be delayed. The worry is, for how long? And is this crisis going to last a long time? And is it going to take such a huge impact on and take away a lot of growth of the European economies that we're going to end up with starting with from a base, if you like, which is so much lower that is going to require an awful lot of work afterwards. On the positive side, of course, greenhouse emissions have been reduced because we're not producing anything. Everything is clearer. The skies are blue, as you know, in Europe, which we hadn't been able to see for ages. So,
Vicky, not just Europe. This is a good opportunity for us to float in some pictures as you continue talking. First ones are of Delhi just over 1 year ago, or perhaps it's even towards the end of 2019. That's the India Gate War Memorial. I mean, you could hardly see a thing in that. But the other picture was taken, I think it was just a few weeks or a few months later, after the lockdown, after the traffic had gone. And I mean, look, that's totally different. What a wonderful place it is. And I've been there now, and I know what the pollution can be like. The other one is a sky shot of Italy showing nitrogen dioxide levels and how they had changed in just a very short space of time. The question is, do you think politicians as well as people will get it when they see images like that? Vicky, you first, and then you, Michael.
People are terribly excited about this, but they also know that they want to be earning a living. And the politicians will want to get the economy back to normal, or perhaps a new normal, as quickly as possible. The question is whether that normality is no longer achievable, and whether that new beginning can actually have more green policies in it, so we can grow greener in the future, because we have seen what it means if things are clearer and we breathe better. There are so many deaths coming every year anyway, out of premature deaths coming out of air pollution every year in the industrialized world. And you talked about the various pictures, and of course China was a very interesting one too, where nitrogen levels had just sort of disappeared and then suddenly they're coming back again now the production is resuming. Is China going to do anything major about this? But I think Europe is quite serious about achieving its targets, just as we've been hearing. In any case, the question is it going to have enough, as you rightly asked, the political will to be able to get back to the path it had chosen to go down? And there will be, I think, some pressure from the population to get there. I think what they've seen, they have liked from that point of view. They haven't liked the loss of income, but they have liked the environmental aspects of this, and they will be pushing.
Michael, earlier in the program, we talked about the Czech Republic and Poland being reluctant in the first instance for the European Green Deal. And I want to bring up France and Germany because a number of environment and climate ministers from EU countries wrote to the Commission saying, among other things, we need to send a strong signal to the world and our citizens that the EU will lead by example. Now, notable by their absence from that letter were anybody representing France and Germany. Are they simply being pragmatic, the bigger countries, or are they just not quite as fast as the others to realize the opportunity?
I think that might change. I think there has been some support for building back having green strings attached to COVID-19 recovery. I think there is some support among France and Germany for that. And actually, just today, the Petersburg Climate Dialogue, it was introduced, which is hosted by Germany and the UK. The German minister Scholz, the environment minister, made very similar comments along these lines about the need to make sure that climate targets are still submitted this year, even though COP26 has been delayed till next year. So there's a lot of positive noises coming from those countries, and obviously France and Germany and Italy as well. Let's not forget, these are key countries in Europe. They're hugely influential, and there will be some pushback from countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia, where they derive huge amounts of their energy from coal power, for example. But there's also not forget that the coal industry in Poland is seriously struggling right now. It's in danger of collapsing because of low power demand. That isn't the same thing that we're seeing for renewables. So there is a need really to make sure that these countries that are heavily reliant on fossil fuel industries are given the support that they need to transition, and that they are given the support to make sure politically that that transition can happen. Because yes, there is a danger here that the economy in certain countries may struggle with the same kind of funding or economic base to transition to net zero, but the dangers of inaction are actually greater. We can see crises like this happen once again. There are lots of mega trends and shocks that can happen to the economy. By building a more resilient society based on renewable energy base that is more energy secure, that it's nationally produced, rather than relying on, the geopolitical threats that are posed to the oil industry, for example. We've seen the volatility in that industry.
Yeah, we've seen how the price of oil has tanked in the last few months, not because of this. But Vicky, I wondered whether and there we heard Michael mentioning Czech Republic and Poland and the reasons why they may be against this. Do you see other interested parties who may not be that keen on continuing with green policies?
Obviously, there are quite a lot of industries that still rely on fossil fuel. And there are, of course, the industries that produce oil and gas, and they need support as well. Of course, they have been moving themselves towards being greener. So there is a possibility of getting firms that are getting support, whether it's the airline sector, which of course has been under pressure as well, whether it's the car manufacturing sector, which needs to change, whether the support that you give to them during this crisis can then be conditional to them pursuing a much greener future. So there's a lot more investment. We've seen in the past that government regulations have made a huge difference in this area. So we could have a conditional sort of release from the obligations that these firms have on the financial front when we come out of the crisis, on the assumption that they will then pursue green production much faster than they had done in the past. So you could see that happen, but for the moment they wouldn't have that great interest because they need to get back to production as quickly as possible.
Vicky, are you a believer in the credo that out of terrible disasters come some wonderful innovation? After the First World War, social housing; out of the Green Deal, social services; out of the Second World War, in the UK at least, the National Health Services. Therefore, this is an opportunity, and it's quite likely that some good in terms of climate policy will eventually be seen.
I think so. I think it's not just the climate change, but also the way we work. And of course, the way we work is linked to it too. People are now used to working from home, and you find also the manufacturing production is such that it uses fewer people. It actually invests quite a lot more in the types of sort of AI and what have you, which could make a difference in terms of the energy that's being used and how production processes are done. We could indeed end up in a situation where, from a green perspective, we're considerably more productive than was the case before. It needs to be sustained and needs to be encouraged by governments. It probably won't happen entirely on its own, but as we said earlier, I think the population and the workers will play a part in asking for that new future as
Michael,
well.
Michael, it is a balancing act. Is anybody going to fall off?
I think the difficult thing is clearly the political side of things. The economic case, I think, is quite clear for renewable and green stimulus and green strings being attached to recovery plans, as has been made clear in various reports actually in recent weeks. The International Renewable Energy Association estimated that by ambitiously pushing towards a greener economy, we can derive a 2.4% boost in GDP by 2050 than would otherwise be achieved, and create 40 million jobs and a 98 trillion boost to the economy globally. And that's around the world. That's not just in Europe. And Europe, of course, is further ahead in its transition. It's already got a base. We're not talking about a revolution in the economy. We're talking about evolution, really. We're already in a situation where Europe is generating around 20%, just under 20% of its energy from renewables. The technology, the ability, the investment and the capital is already there. There will be capital floating around at the end of this.
And going back to what I said at the beginning of this section of the program about Apollo 13, let us hope when it comes to the European Green Deal, it is not a case of Houston, we have a problem, but perhaps the Eagle has landed safely. Thank you, Vicky Pryce. Thank you, Michael Holder, very much indeed for joining us on Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from the team, we thank you for watching, and we hope to have your company next time.